For years, the case of Mackenzie Shirilla has sparked fierce debate across social media, courtrooms, documentaries, and true crime communities. Some people see a reckless teenager whose actions ended in unimaginable tragedy. Others see a young woman who insists she never intended to hurt anyone and has spent years fighting against the label of murderer. But regardless of where people stand, one question continues to surface again and again. What was really happening behind the scenes before that deadly crash? Long before prosecutors presented evidence in court, before headlines spread across the country, and before documentaries revisited the case, there was a relationship. Like many teenage relationships, it began with excitement, affection, and the feeling that nothing could separate two young people who wanted to spend every possible moment together. Yet, according to thousands of messages later examined by investigators, that relationship would gradually evolve into something far more complicated. The story is not simply about a crash. It is not simply about a criminal case. In many ways, it is also the story of two teenagers whose relationship appeared increasingly volatile as time went on. The messages exchanged between Mackenzie Shirilla and Dominic Russo provide a rare glimpse into private moments that would later be scrutinized by detectives, prosecutors, defense attorneys, journalists, and the public. Those messages reveal arguments. They reveal affection. They reveal insecurity. They reveal frustration. And perhaps most importantly, they reveal a relationship that seemed trapped in a cycle neither person could fully escape. When investigators later reviewed years of communications, they discovered not dozens of messages, but tens of thousands. Every argument, every reconciliation, every emotional outburst, and every attempt to repair the relationship created a digital trail stretching back years. At first glance, many of the messages appear ordinary. Young couples argue. Young couples become jealous. Young couples sometimes struggle to communicate. Yet, as investigators continued reviewing the conversations, certain exchanges stood out. Some appeared to show emotional dependence. Others appeared to reveal repeated threats of ending the relationship. And several exchanges would later become central to prosecutors' theory of the case. To understand why these messages became so important, it helps to understand the nature of the relationship itself. By many accounts, Mackenzie and Dominic spent enormous amounts of time together. Friends and family members described a relationship that was deeply intertwined. They communicated constantly. They spent significant portions of their days together. Their lives appeared connected in ways that can often happen when young couples become emotionally dependent on one another. But with that closeness came conflict. According to records later examined during legal proceedings, arguments seemed to erupt frequently. Sometimes the disputes appeared relatively minor. Other times, they involved accusations, emotional confrontations, and discussions about whether the relationship should continue at all. One of the recurring themes found throughout the messages was a fear of separation. Several exchanges suggested that even temporary distance could trigger intense emotional reactions. When Dominic wanted space, the response was often immediate concern. When communication slowed down, frustration sometimes followed. When discussions of breaking up emerged, emotions appeared to escalate rapidly. For prosecutors, these interactions would later become important because they argued that the relationship's instability provided critical context for understanding events that occurred in the summer of 2022. The defense, however, viewed the messages differently. They argued that the conversations reflected the normal struggles of a young relationship, rather than evidence of murderous intent. This disagreement would eventually become one of the most important battles in the entire case. As investigators reconstructed the timeline, they discovered messages dating back years before the crash. Those early conversations paint a picture of a relationship still in its formative stages. In some exchanges, Mackenzie appeared eager to spend as much time as possible with Dominic. She frequently asked about seeing him, visiting him, or making plans together. Many teenagers would likely recognize the emotions behind those messages. The excitement of young love often creates a desire to be constantly connected. Yet, not every interaction was positive. At times, Dominic appeared to push back against the constant contact. Some messages suggested he wanted more personal space. Other exchanges hinted at growing frustration over the intensity of the relationship. This difference in expectations seemed to create recurring tension. One argument in particular would later attract attention because it highlighted a pattern investigators believed appeared repeatedly throughout the relationship. The disagreement began with a discussion about spending time together. What might have seemed like a relatively ordinary conversation quickly evolved into accusations and emotional responses. As the argument intensified, messages reflected feelings of rejection, frustration, and despair. These were not isolated incidents. Over time, investigators identified numerous conversations that followed similar patterns. One person sought reassurance, the other sought distance. That distance then triggered emotional responses, leading to another argument, followed by attempts at reconciliation. The cycle appeared again and again. What makes the messages particularly compelling is that neither person appears entirely responsible for the conflict. Instead, the conversations often reveal two young individuals struggling to manage emotions neither fully understood. As months passed, the relationship continued. The arguments continued as well. Friends and family members reportedly witnessed the ups and downs. Breakups occurred, reconciliations followed, promises were made, new disputes emerged. Yet, despite the turbulence, the relationship endured. At times, the messages revealed genuine affection. There are conversations suggesting care, attachment, and emotional dependence. These moments complicate any attempt to view the relationship in simplistic terms. Because while prosecutors would later argue that certain messages suggested motive, other communications suggested strong emotional bonds. That contradiction remains one of the reasons the case continues generating debate years later. How can a relationship appear deeply loving in some moments and intensely hostile in others? The answer may lie in the reality that many relationships, especially among teenagers, often contain both. As 2020 became 2021, the tone of some conversations appeared to shift. Arguments seemed increasingly frequent, frustrations seemed increasingly difficult to resolve, and discussions about ending the relationship became more common. What neither of them could have known was that investigators would one day examine nearly every message, searching for clues about a tragedy that had not yet occurred. And as the relationship moved closer to the summer of 2022, some of the conversations would become impossible to ignore. Because, according to prosecutors, the most important messages were still ahead. And those messages would eventually become part of one of the most controversial murder cases in recent memory. As the relationship moved deeper into 2021, the arguments between Mackenzie Shirilla and Dominic Russo appeared to become more frequent, and at times more intense. Looking back at the thousands of messages later reviewed by investigators, one theme emerges repeatedly. Neither person seemed able to fully walk away from the relationship, even when both appeared exhausted by the constant conflict. The pattern was familiar. An argument would erupt over something that seemed small at first. A delayed response, a misunderstanding, a disagreement about plans. But then the conversation would grow. Accusations would follow. Feelings would be hurt. One of them would threaten to end the relationship. Then, somehow, they would find their way back to each other again. To outside observers, it may have looked like a typical teenage romance filled with highs and lows, but prosecutors would later argue that the messages showed something more concerning. They believed the conversations demonstrated an increasingly unhealthy dynamic that had developed over time. One of the most revealing aspects of the text messages was the constant discussion about time together. Many exchanges centered around whether Dominic was spending enough time with Mackenzie, whether he was giving her enough attention, and whether he was prioritizing the relationship. Again and again, frustration surfaced when expectations were not met. In some conversations, Mackenzie appeared to express a deep need for reassurance. In others, Dominic appeared overwhelmed by the pressure he felt to constantly prove his commitment. The result was a cycle that seemed impossible to escape. What makes the messages particularly fascinating is that they reveal not only what each person was saying, but what each person feared. Mackenzie often appeared afraid of losing the relationship. Dominic often appeared frustrated by the conflict surrounding the relationship. Those fears repeatedly collided, and every collision seemed to leave new emotional damage behind. As investigators reconstructed the timeline years later, they found numerous exchanges that suggested the relationship had become increasingly volatile. There were accusations of dishonesty, arguments about loyalty, disputes over social media activity, disagreements involving friends, conversations about trust, and recurring threats to break up. Many couples experienced some version of these problems, but what caught investigators' attention was how often these issues appeared and how intensely they were discussed. At times, the messages seemed less like conversations and more like emotional battles. One person demanding answers, the other person refusing to engage. one person escalating, the other withdrawing, then the entire process starting again. Some messages suggested that Dominic was becoming increasingly aware of the unhealthy nature of the relationship. There were moments where he appeared to acknowledge that the constant fighting was taking a toll. He spoke about needing space. He spoke about wanting peace. He spoke about the difficulty of continuing a relationship that seemed trapped in perpetual conflict. But every time separation appeared possible, something pulled them back together. That cycle would continue for months. Then came another issue that repeatedly appeared in the messages: jealousy. Social media had become a major part of both teenagers' lives. Photos, comments, messages, followers, attention from others. All of it created new opportunities for misunderstandings and conflict. Some conversations involved concerns about how photos were being presented online. Others involved suspicions about interactions with different people. Arguments that might once have remained private now had a digital dimension that seemed to amplify every disagreement. Investigators later noted how often social media became a source of tension. In some exchanges, Dominic appeared uncomfortable with certain content being posted. In others, Mackenzie appeared unwilling to change her behavior simply because someone else objected. The disagreements rarely ended with a clear resolution. Instead, they tended to evolve into broader arguments about trust, respect, and commitment. By early 2022, the relationship appeared increasingly unstable. Yet, despite all the fighting, neither seemed fully prepared to let go. That contradiction would become one of the most important aspects of the case, because when prosecutors later argued that motive existed, they pointed to the emotional volatility reflected in these conversations. The defense, meanwhile, argued that conflict alone does not equal intent. Countless relationships experience arguments. Countless couples exchange emotional messages. Countless people say things they later regret. The existence of conflict, they argued, was not proof of murder. Still, prosecutors believed the messages provided critical context. And as investigators moved closer to the summer of 2022, some of the conversations became increasingly difficult to ignore. One recurring topic involved marijuana. Messages suggested that Dominic was sometimes a source of cannabis. References appeared throughout different exchanges. While these discussions were not the central focus of the criminal case, they contributed to the overall picture investigators were attempting to build. They wanted to understand every aspect of the relationship, every disagreement, every pattern, every possible clue. Nothing was considered insignificant. The reason was simple. After the crash, investigators would face a question that seemed almost impossible to answer. Why? Why would a 17-year-old drive a vehicle into a building at such extraordinary speed? Why was there no apparent attempt to brake? Why did the evidence point in the direction it did? And could the answer be found somewhere within years of digital conversations? By mid-2022, tensions appeared to be growing. The relationship was still together, but the messages suggested increasing frustration, increasing emotional exhaustion, and increasing uncertainty about the future. Dominic, in particular, appeared to be reaching a point where he was questioning whether the relationship could continue. That reality would become especially important in the weeks before the crash, because some of the most heavily discussed messages in the entire case were exchanged during that period. According to records later presented and discussed publicly, Dominic communicated concerns about the constant fighting. He expressed doubts about the future. He discussed the possibility that staying together might no longer be healthy. Those messages would later be examined repeatedly by prosecutors, journalists, and true crime analysts, not because they proved anything on their own, but because of what happened afterward. The timing made them impossible to ignore. As July 2022 approached, the relationship seemed to be entering another period of instability. Arguments continued, communication became strained, and discussions about breaking up resurfaced once again. Some messages reflected anger. Others reflected sadness. Still others reflected resignation. For Dominic, there were signs that he may have been growing tired of the endless cycle. For Mackenzie, there appeared to be ongoing frustration about the state of the relationship. Neither seemed satisfied. Neither seemed at peace. And yet, neither fully disappeared from the other's life. Then came messages that would later receive enormous attention. Messages involving discussions about happiness. Messages involving discussions about the future. Messages involving whether the relationship should continue at all. To prosecutors, these conversations represented potential evidence of a deteriorating relationship. To the defense, they represented ordinary relationship struggles. The interpretation depended largely on what someone believed happened on the night of the crash. That is one reason the case remains so controversial. People often begin with their conclusion and then interpret the messages through that lens. If someone believes the crash was intentional, the texts appear ominous. If someone believes the crash resulted from some other cause, the texts appear tragic, but not necessarily predictive. The divide remains today. Yet, regardless of perspective, there is no denying that the relationship was under significant strain during the final weeks. And as investigators later pieced together those final weeks, one question kept resurfacing. Was this simply another breakup cycle? Or was something fundamentally different happening this time? The answer may never be known with complete certainty. But according to prosecutors, the final month before the crash contained some of the most important clues in the entire case. Clues they believed pointed toward motive. Clues they believed explained what happened. Clues that would eventually help convince a judge to convict. But before that courtroom battle could take place, another series of events would unfold. Events that prosecutors would later describe as some of the most troubling developments in the entire timeline. And those events would bring the case one step closer to the night that changed everything. By July of 2022, the relationship between Mackenzie Shirilla and Dominic Russo appeared to be approaching a breaking point. For years, the two had cycled through arguments, reconciliations, emotional confrontations, and discussions about whether they should remain together. But according to prosecutors, the final weeks before the crash carried a different tone. There was a growing sense that something was changing. When investigators later reviewed the messages exchanged during that period, they found conversations that appeared increasingly focused on the future of the relationship. More specifically, they found evidence suggesting that Dominic was questioning whether the relationship should continue at all. One message would later receive enormous attention. In that conversation, Dominic expressed feelings that many people interpreted as emotional exhaustion. He talked about the constant fighting. He talked about how difficult things had become. He suggested that the relationship might no longer be working. To some observers, it sounded like someone reaching a painful conclusion. To others, it sounded like a temporary frustration that might eventually pass. At the time, neither Dominic nor Mackenzie could have known that those messages would later be dissected by prosecutors and defense attorneys in a murder case. Yet years later, those words would become part of a larger argument about motive. According to records later examined during the investigation, Dominic communicated that he did not want to spend his life constantly fighting. He expressed concerns that the relationship had become trapped in a cycle that neither person seemed capable of escaping. What stood out to investigators was not simply that an argument occurred, it was the possibility that Dominic was genuinely considering ending the relationship. Prosecutors would later argue that this possibility was significant, because if one person believed the relationship was ending, emotions could become heightened, expectations could collapse, and long-standing tensions could reach a breaking point. The defense, however, rejected any suggestion that relationship problems alone could establish intent. After all, countless relationships end every day without violence. Still, prosecutors believed the timing mattered. The breakup discussions occurred only weeks before the deadly crash. That proximity would become a major point of focus during legal proceedings. As July continued, the messages revealed a relationship that appeared increasingly strained. There were accusations, there were frustrations, there were demands for explanations, and there were moments where both individuals seemed emotionally drained. Some conversations reflected anger, others reflected sadness, some reflected confusion, but together they painted a picture of a relationship struggling to survive. One of the most debated incidents involved allegations surrounding another driving-related confrontation. According to later accounts, there was an argument involving a vehicle and accusations that someone's actions had endangered lives. The details became heavily disputed. Different versions of events emerged. Each side described the confrontation differently. Yet, what made the incident remarkable was what happened afterward. The argument continued through text messages, and those texts would later become part of the broader narrative prosecutors used to explain the final weeks before the crash. In the messages, accusations flew back and forth. One side claimed dangerous behavior had occurred. The other denied intending any harm. Neither appeared willing to fully accept the other's version of events. The disagreement became emotional, at times intensely emotional. Looking back, some observers have described these conversations as chilling, not because they predicted what would happen, but because they involved discussions about safety, driving, and life-threatening situations only days before a deadly crash. The coincidence is difficult to ignore. At the same time, it is important to distinguish between hindsight and evidence. People often look backward after a tragedy and search for warning signs. Sometimes those signs are meaningful. Sometimes they only appear meaningful because everyone already knows the outcome. That distinction became central to the legal battle that followed. Nevertheless, prosecutors believed the messages revealed important information about the emotional state of the relationship. They argued that the conflicts were becoming more serious, more frequent, and more difficult to resolve. As investigators continued reviewing communications from July 2022, they found more evidence of tension. Arguments erupted over trust. Arguments erupted over communication. Arguments erupted over commitment. And increasingly, the future of the relationship seemed uncertain. Perhaps the most striking aspect of the final messages is how ordinary some of them appear. There is no dramatic declaration that explains everything, no single text that instantly reveals what was about to happen. Instead, there is something arguably more unsettling. Normal conversations, routine arguments, everyday frustrations, the kind of interactions that occur in relationships all the time, and then suddenly, the timeline ends. That reality continues to fascinate people who follow the case, because there is an almost unbearable contrast between the ordinary nature of the messages and the extraordinary tragedy that followed. For investigators, however, the focus was not simply on the words themselves, it was on the broader pattern, the pattern of conflict, the pattern of emotional dependence, the pattern of breakup threats, the pattern of instability. They believed those patterns helped explain what happened next. The defense disagreed. They argued that prosecutors were attempting to build a narrative out of ordinary relationship struggles. The crash itself, they maintained, did not prove intent. And without intent, the prosecution's theory could not stand. That disagreement would ultimately be decided in court. But before any judge could weigh the evidence, investigators first had to reconstruct the final hours before the crash. Those final hours remain among the most scrutinized aspects of the entire case. According to evidence later presented, Mackenzie, Dominic, and their friend Devon Flanagan spent time together during the evening and early morning hours before the collision. Exactly what happened during every moment remains the subject of ongoing discussion. What is known is that eventually the three young people ended up inside the same vehicle. What happened next would forever alter multiple families. At some point during the early morning hours of July 31, 2022, the vehicle accelerated. Data later reviewed by investigators would become critically important. According to prosecutors, the evidence showed rapid acceleration. According to their interpretation of the evidence, there was no meaningful attempt to brake before impact. That conclusion would become one of the strongest pillars of the state's case. Because if a driver intentionally maintained acceleration, prosecutors argued, the crash could not be dismissed as a simple accident. The vehicle ultimately left the roadway. It crossed a curb. It traveled through an area where a driver would normally attempt corrective action. Then it struck a commercial building at an extremely high speed. The force of the collision was catastrophic. Dominic Russo was killed. Devon Flanagan was killed. Mackenzie Shirilla survived with serious injuries. Almost immediately, investigators faced a question that would define the entire case. Was this a tragic accident? Or was it something else? The answer would determine whether the crash remained a traffic fatality or became a homicide investigation. At first, investigators focused heavily on physical evidence, vehicle data, crash reconstruction, roadway conditions, mechanical inspections, medical information, witness accounts. Every detail mattered. The more investigators examined the evidence, the more they believed the crash required deeper scrutiny. According to prosecutors, several factors stood out: the speed, the acceleration, the lack of braking, the trajectory of the vehicle, and eventually, the relationship history revealed through thousands of messages. Taken together, prosecutors believed those elements pointed toward intent. The defense disagreed completely. They argued there were alternative explanations. They argued memory issues complicated the case. They argued prosecutors were making assumptions about what occurred inside the vehicle during the final moments. The battle lines were forming. What began as a devastating crash was evolving into one of the most controversial criminal prosecutions in Ohio. And soon, the courtroom would become the place where both sides attempted to convince a judge of what really happened during those final seconds. Because while the crash itself shocked investigators, what happened during the trial would bring even greater national attention to the case. And the evidence presented in court would leave many people asking the same question that still lingers today. Did prosecutors truly prove intent beyond a reasonable doubt? Or did they simply construct the most persuasive explanation available for a tragedy that may never be fully understood? That question would soon be placed before a judge, and the answer would change Mackenzie Shirilla's life forever. When the case finally reached court, it was already one of the most discussed criminal prosecutions in Ohio. The crash itself was shocking enough to generate headlines. A 17-year-old driver, 2 teenage passengers killed, a vehicle traveling at extraordinary speed, allegations that the collision was intentional, and thousands of text messages that prosecutors believed revealed the emotional context leading up to the tragedy. But despite the public attention, the legal question before the court was remarkably straightforward. Did the evidence prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Mackenzie Shirilla intentionally caused the crash? That question would determine everything. The prosecution entered the courtroom with a theory they believed was supported by both physical evidence and the history of the relationship between Mackenzie and Dominic. According to prosecutors, this was not a reckless accident. It was not a medical episode. It was not a momentary loss of control. They argued that the evidence pointed toward a deliberate act. To support that claim, prosecutors focused heavily on crash reconstruction evidence. They presented findings that suggested the vehicle accelerated to an extremely high speed before impact. Investigators examined data collected from the vehicle and attempted to reconstruct the final moments before the collision. One of the most important arguments involved braking. According to prosecutors, there was little evidence that meaningful braking occurred before the vehicle struck the building. That conclusion became a central pillar of their case, because they believed it contradicted explanations involving panic or an attempt to avoid the collision. The state argued that the physical evidence told a story of acceleration, a story of commitment to a path, and ultimately, a story of intent. But physical evidence was only part of the prosecution's strategy. The state also devoted significant attention to the relationship between Mackenzie and Dominic. This is where the text messages became important. Prosecutors argued that the communications revealed escalating tension. They pointed to recurring arguments. They pointed to breakup discussions. They pointed to evidence suggesting that Dominic had become increasingly frustrated with the relationship. Most importantly, they pointed to messages indicating that Dominic may have wanted to end things. According to prosecutors, these communications helped explain motive. They argued that the relationship had reached a critical point, a point where emotions were running high, a point where rejection may have become increasingly difficult to accept, a point where the future of the relationship appeared uncertain. The defense saw things very differently. Defense attorneys argued that prosecutors were building a narrative rather than proving intent. Yes, the relationship had problems. Yes, there were arguments. Yes, there were emotional messages. But defense attorneys argued that troubled relationships are common, arguments are common, breakups are common. None of those things automatically prove murder. The defense also focused on Mackenzie's claims regarding memory loss. She maintained that she could not remember the crash itself. She claimed to have no memory of the moments leading immediately up to the collision. That assertion became a major point of debate. Critics questioned whether the memory loss claims were credible. Supporters argued that traumatic injuries can affect memory. Medical experts, legal analysts, and members of the public debated the issue extensively. Yet, memory loss alone did not answer the central question. The court still needed to determine what happened before the collision. Another major area of disagreement involved potential medical explanations. Members of Mackenzie's family suggested that a medical condition may have contributed to the crash. Discussion centered around the possibility of a blackout or loss of consciousness. However, prosecutors argued that the evidence presented did not support that explanation. According to the state's position, there was insufficient proof that a medical episode caused the collision. This dispute became one of the most closely watched aspects of the trial. Because if a medical emergency caused the crash, the prosecution's theory would be severely weakened. If no such emergency occurred, prosecutors believed their theory remained intact. Throughout the proceedings, the judge was tasked with evaluating an enormous amount of information: crash reconstruction reports, digital evidence, witness testimony, text messages, expert opinions, medical discussions, relationship history. Every piece of evidence carried weight. Every argument was scrutinized. Every conclusion was challenged. The trial itself attracted national attention because many observers recognized how unusual the case was. Intent is often difficult to prove. In many homicide cases, prosecutors rely on direct evidence such as admissions, eyewitness testimony, or clearly documented planning. This case was different. The state relied heavily on circumstantial evidence. They argued that when all the pieces were assembled, the conclusion became unavoidable. The defense argued the opposite. They maintained that prosecutors were asking the court to make assumptions about events that no surviving witness could fully describe. At the center of the case was a reality neither side could change. The two people who might have provided the clearest answers were gone. Dominic Russo was gone. Devon Flanagan was gone. And because they were no longer alive, many questions would never be answered directly. Eventually, after reviewing the evidence, the judge reached a decision. Mackenzie Shirilla was found guilty. The verdict sent shockwaves through legal circles and true crime communities. Some people viewed the decision as justice, others viewed it as controversial. Debate erupted almost immediately. Supporters of the verdict argued that the physical evidence was overwhelming. They believed the speed of the vehicle, the lack of braking, and the relationship evidence collectively demonstrated intent. Critics argued that the case relied too heavily on interpretation. They questioned whether prosecutors had truly eliminated every reasonable alternative explanation. The controversy only grew following sentencing. Mackenzie received a life sentence with the possibility of parole after serving a significant portion of her term. For the families of the victims, the verdict represented accountability. For supporters of Mackenzie, it represented a tragedy layered on top of an already devastating event. Yet, even after the trial ended, public fascination with the case continued. Years later, renewed attention emerged through documentaries, interviews, and media coverage. The case reached new audiences. People who had never followed the original proceedings suddenly found themselves examining the evidence. They watched interviews, they reviewed court records, they debated the meaning of the text messages. And once again, the same questions resurfaced. Were the messages evidence of motive? Or were they evidence of nothing more than a troubled teenage relationship? Was the crash intentional? Or was it a catastrophic event that prosecutors interpreted through the lens of hindsight? The truth is that many people continue to disagree. What cannot be disputed is the devastating outcome. 2 young men lost their lives. Families were forever changed. A teenager was sentenced to spend years behind bars. And a case that began with a relationship ended with a criminal conviction that continues generating discussion today. Perhaps that is why the text messages remain so fascinating. They offer a glimpse into a world that existed before the headlines, before the courtroom, before the verdict, before national attention transformed private conversations into public evidence. Those messages reveal 2 teenagers trying to navigate a complicated relationship. Sometimes they were affectionate. Sometimes they were angry. Sometimes they appeared unable to communicate effectively. Sometimes they appeared unable to separate from one another. Looking back now, it is tempting to search those messages for answers, to identify a single moment that explains everything. A warning sign, a turning point, a clue hidden in plain sight. But real life rarely works that way. Human relationships are messy, emotions are complicated, and tragedies often leave behind more questions than answers. What remains certain is that the crash on July 31st, 2022 permanently altered multiple lives. It transformed private text messages into courtroom evidence. It transformed a troubled relationship into the centerpiece of a homicide prosecution. And it transformed a local tragedy into one of the most debated criminal cases in recent memory. Even now, years later, people continue to examine the evidence and ask whether the full story has ever truly been understood. The courts have reached their conclusion. The verdict stands. But in the court of public opinion, the debate surrounding the relationship, the messages, the crash, and the question of intent continues. And that may be why this case refuses to disappear from public conversation. Because beneath the legal arguments, beneath the headlines, and beneath the endless analysis lies a mystery that still captures attention today. Not simply how the crash happened, but why.